Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Welcome to News Laundry, Dinesh. We have with us today Dinesh Thakur. Dinesh was the Director and Global Health, Research, Information and Portfolio Management at Ranbaxy Laboratories from 2003 to 2005. Ranbaxy was at that time India's largest generic drug manufacturer. He was responsible for managing research and development, information for generic drug development, manufacturing and commercial operations. In addition, he implemented automated systems to capture research and development data for global regulatory submissions, compliance and manufacturing. He was recognized with the Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage in 2014 and is the recipient of the ACFE's Cliff Robertson Sentinel Award. He was named Whistleblower of the Year by Taxpayers Against Fraud in 2013. While at Ranbaxy, Dinesh discovered that the company was falsifying drug data and violating current good manufacturing practices and good laboratory practices. He resigned in 2005 after reporting the fraud to company management and worked with authorities for 8 years to unravel the complicated trail of falsified records and dangerous manufacturing practices. In May 2013, Ranbaxy pleaded guilty to multiple criminal felonies and agreed to pay $500 million to resolve criminal and civil allegations of falsified drug data and systemic manufacturing violations resulting in substandard and unapproved drugs. The groundbreaking settlement is the largest of its kind against a generic drug manufacturer. Dinesh, let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
Why did your manager, Dr. Rajinder Kumar, assign you to investigate the extent to which the company had provided made-up data to seek the WHO pre-qualification? How did these suspicions arise?
So Dr. Kumar, who I call Raj, when he was just about 2 months into the company at that point in time. And what had happened was that the WHO inspectors, they had come in and they had inspected, the process by which Ranbaxy was making these antiretroviral drugs. If you remember at that point in time, we were dealing with this HIV epidemic. And what was happening was that the US government essentially had established a program to say that you could procure these medicines at a very low cost compared to what they're made in the US to be distributed in Africa where it was an epidemic at that point in time. But the issue that came up there was that, look, how will we know that these are all good quality, right? I mean, the perceptions always existed, generic drugs, obviously cheap versions. And so while the program was being set up to say that you have to have the US FDA stamp of approval, one of the things that Indian generic companies said, hey, look, you know what? We go by the WHO pre-qualifications process. There is another world body that understands how drugs are made, what quality means, right? If we go through their certification process and they tell us that our drugs are of good quality, you should be okay with that, right? And so the WHO had sent 2 inspectors, Dr. Andre Vanziel and Dr. Olivier Leblaye. They had come to inspect, what kind of patient data was being generated to ensure that these drugs were bioequivalent. So this is a technical term. What this means is that when drugs are first sort of, introduced into the market, the company that actually makes it for the first time, which is called an innovator company because they innovate around this, right? They go through a thorough process, a clinical process of establishing that these drugs are, effective in the patient population that they're being used. The standards that the US had set out at that point in time basically said that as a generic manufacturer, you don't have to repeat all of those studies because they're very, very expensive. What you do need to do is, in a small group of healthy volunteers, if you can replicate the way that this drug works, right, compared to the innovator drug, then we are fairly confident that you know what you're doing. So these 2 inspectors had come to work, to inspect the process. And
the plants themselves or the data?
No, so typical what happens is that when they come to inspect, they look at all aspects of it. But mostly data, because it's very hard to see what is really happening in the plant. You go into manufacturing facility, you see steel tanks, you see, pressure gauges, right? I mean, you're really not going to be able to see much, but you do obviously see, the manufacturing data. So they had gone to this lab that Ranbaxy was using at that point called Vimta Laboratories. It was based in Hyderabad at that point in time. And what they found was that while the Ranbaxy had submitted data saying that we have tested it on 95 patients, they actually were only 2 patients. They copied and pasted all that data of 2 patients over and over again to say that, hey, look, we have tested it on this cohort of 95 patients. One of the first things that had happened was that was highlighted to South Africa because, that was one of the countries that we were going to be dispensing these drugs. The US was going to send these drugs to African countries. South Africa was one of the countries that was going to receive that. So the MCC, the South African regulator, basically highlighted that and said, look, there's a problem here. We don't believe that you're doing it adequately enough for you to be able to tell us that these are drugs that are good quality. So Raj, who was 2 months into his job at that point in time, was told, you need to go talk to these people in Johannesburg, in South Africa, and ensure them that don't worry, we have it under control. So he did go, along with the person who was heading the clinical piece in the company. And on the way back, Raj was told by this person that, look, what you're doing here is not limited just to these HIV drugs. So Raj asked him, well, what do you mean by that? Right? What do you mean by, it's not limited? He said, well, it's a lot more pervasive. So when he got back to India, that was the first time that he called me up and said, I need to know the true extent of this problem.
But when he went to Africa, at that time he found that there was malpractice.
Well, the reason he was sent to Africa was essentially to pacify the South African regulator, MCC, basically saying, look, we know what we are doing. We know that WHO has found some problems, we'll fix it, don't worry about it. I am the head of R&D, because he was the head of R&D at that point in time. And he had a lot of credibility, right? So they sent him to South Africa essentially to sort of do damage control at that point in time. He was just about 2 months into the company, so he had no idea what was really going on.
So in The Bottle of Lies, in Elizabeth Eban's book, she writes that the inspection conducted by a French inspector named Olivier Leblay had uncovered astonishing fraud.
Correct.
Many of the patients Vimta had enrolled in the study did not seem to exist.
Correct.
Much of the data purporting to measure the drug's dissolution in the patient's blood appeared to have been fabricated.
Yes.
The graphs from tests on entirely different patients were identical, as though photocopied. As Thakur, which is you, read, his jaw dropped. There could be no assurance that the medicine had even been given to actual patients, owing to the lack of documentation. And there was no evidence that Ranbaxy had monitored the work or audited the results as was required. This level of fraud meant that the drugs destined for terribly sick AIDS patients had essentially been untested. So on the plane back to India, this discussion took place about the extent of how widespread this fraudulent practice was within the company. So that was when your team, you created 6 project managers.
No, so I already had these project managers. I mean, we were looking at, so my job, the reason I was hired by Ranbaxy was because this company they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, it was essentially run by the seat of their pants.
Who had no idea?
Ranbaxy as a company, they had no idea what they were doing, in the sense that they had in their business units, they had a head of United States business, they had a head of European business, they had a head of India business, they had a head of Latin America business, but these people essentially had no coordination among them. So they would go, so there was one research and development group within the company. So all of these business groups would go and make demands of the research and development saying, we need these products because that's how
we need these drugs.
We need these drugs because the market needs those drugs, right? Now, there's only one research and development group. How do they cross-prioritize? If the person from the US comes and says, I need you to work on this, and the person from Latin America comes and says, I need you to work on this, how does the person who's responsible for R&D prioritize those 2 requests? Which comes first, right? So obviously there has to be some criteria to say, how much money are we going to make? If you develop a drug for the US, are we going to make more money? Or how what kind of competition exists in these markets? Are we going to be the only drug that is available at that point in time? Because then obviously you'll command a higher price, right? If there is more of a competition, then clearly, our pricing capability is going to be lower than perhaps if you were the only person at that point in time. How difficult is it to make that drug? Because not all drugs are easy to make, right? Some drugs take a long time to develop because you're trying to reverse engineer the innovator's formulation. They don't give you the recipe, right? For the company like Novartis or Merck, they won't come and say, hey, you know what? Now that our patent is expired, here is, take our book, go back and then you can make this. It doesn't happen that way. So you have to reverse engineer these things and figure out how to make it. Some are a lot more complex. So you have to look at that and say, this may take me 2 years, 3 years to develop, right? As against another request that perhaps I can do it in 6 months. So these are kind of things that actually had to be done. Until I came around, this company actually had no platform to do this. So my job was essentially to figure out how do I bring all of these people onto the same page along with the management of the company, because ultimately they're the decision makers, right? But ensure that all that information is provided on one piece of paper so that you can weigh which request needs to be funded, because at the end of the day, the management has to fund research and development.
Now,
right?
this conversation that you had with an assistant, where you asked what percentage of the dossiers submitted to regulators contained data that did not match what the company had on file.
Right.
And it says in the book the assistant was evasive. It varies from region to region. So you asked him give me an estimate in each region.
Yeah.
How about in the United States? And the assistant thought for a moment and he said perhaps between 50 or 60%.
Correct.
Ranbaxy had faked over half its dossiers to the FDA.
That's correct.
And that was one of the better regions.
Correct.
Now, how about Europe, you asked? He said about the same.
We'll see, yeah.
And India, after some hemming and hawing, the assistant answered 100%.
Correct.
Now,
Correct.
that to us and the viewers is the story. That Ranbaxy was selling drugs to India which were 100% on fake data, not tested, some with adulteration, some with even found with blue glass, chips of glass in it,
Yes.
some with wax and oil.
Correct.
For the solution to get mixed properly. And this was done in a planned, systemized way,
Yes.
institutionalized in fact within the company. Now, when your managers came back with the report of the altered tests,
Yes.
with higher impurities than was approved, and faked dissolution studies, they had also crushed up brand name drugs into capsules, so those could be tested in lieu of the company's own drugs. For some markets, the company fraudulently mixed and matched data streams, taking the best data from manufacturing in one market and presenting it to regulators elsewhere.
Right.
Document forgery was pervasive.
Yep.
The company even forged its own standard operating procedures. In one instance, employees backdated documents and then artificially aged them in a steamy room overnight in an attempt to fool regulators during inspections. There was little effort to conceal this method of doing business. It was common knowledge from senior management to heads of research and development to the people responsible for formulation. Now, the company was committing fraud and potentially harming patients on a global scale. You distilled this information on a 4-page report.
No, it was, well, I think it was more than that. It was, initially it was a 4-page report, but the PowerPoint presentation that was made to the board, that was like 24 slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was presented to the
Scientific
board.
committee of the board of directors.
Your boss,
Yes.
Mr. Kumar.
Dr. Kumar, yep.
Dr. Kumar, he presented
He
it to
made
the
the
board.
presentation, correct.
Now, when he presented it to the board, his expectation was that they would ask for an investigation, recall of the medicines, which is normal procedure, and fix the problem.
Yes.
In fact, Brian Tempest said that the report should be destroyed.
Yep.
The server on which it was made should be destroyed.
The laptop.
The laptop, everything related to this report should be destroyed.
Right.
There was, and the board went along with it?
Well, I mean, they basically sort of made it such that the minutes essentially were never made. They sent the secretary out of the room. That way, the meeting wasn't minuted. It essentially was never reported.
The board of directors at that time were Tajinder Khanna,
Correct.
who was at one time Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. Malvinder was the CEO and was a permanent invitee.
Well, no, he was the head of business. Brian was the CEO at that point in time.
Brian was, okay.
Yeah.
And then J.W. Balani, Vivek Bharatram,
Correct.
V.K. Kaul, Vivek Mehra, Harpal Singh, Ravi Malhotra, Surendra Daulat Singh, Brian Tempest, and Ramesh Adij. What is missing in this? Yeah. Now, Dr. P.S. Joshi, is a cardiologist.
P.S. Joshi and Dr. Nityanand were the permanent members of the scientific committee at that point in time.
Now, in Elizabeth Eban's book, she said one scientist objected to burying the report. Who was that scientist? Was it Dr. P.C. Joshi?
Well, it was Dr. Nityanand.
And he said that something should be done about it. Now, when Dr. Kumar came out of that meeting, he had a conversation with you. What did he tell you?
He basically said that, this is not the place for people like you and me. He resigned, 2 days right after that.
Did he describe to you what happened in the meeting?
Yes, he did.
Could you tell us what happened?
He basically said, I went through the slides that you put together. I made the presentation. And I told them that, give me the authority to fix this. He said that, this is not something that's new. I mean, going by what I had found out, that it appears that everybody knew about this. His predecessor knew about it. But he said, there's nothing that I can find that has been done to try and fix it. And he said, look, I'm a medical doctor. There's no way I can let this continue because patients, I'm putting patients at risk here. And he said, there's an easy way to do this. We can come clean, we make sure that we do everything right, we make sure that we tell everybody this is what will happen. In the long run, we'll still be good if you did this right. But the response that he saw, which is destroy this, destroy that, get the secretary out of the room, basically told him, look, nothing's going to change.
But did they give any reasoning? What was the reasoning of destroying and not fixing the problem? What was their thinking? That would it mean too expensive?
I don't know. I mean, you're asking me to read, the minds of people who were in the boardroom. I don't know.
Was there any discussion that should we fix it or should we destroy the evidence?
From what I was told, it was pin drop silence once he finished. And basically to say, look, just get rid of this thing. We don't want this anywhere near us.
That is shocking that only one person objected to it.
Yeah.
And the rest of them, all these eminent people, simply went along with the profit motive in mind.
Well, this was a subcommittee of the board, so I'm not sure if everybody attended, right? But I do know that the principal management of the company was there, the scientific advisors were there. I'm not sure if all of the people that you've listed on the board were there, but I would find it, really, sort of astonishing that an issue of this nature, even if it was presented to a subcommittee of the board, would never actually make it to the board's agenda. I mean, if this doesn't come up on the board's agenda, what other issues would be of pressing nature that they need to be discussed at the board level?
But was there any discussion ever that you heard of where they ever brought up the immorality of it, of patients being affected or dying or having long-term side effects?
So Katherine actually documents one conversation where Kathy Spreent, who was a medical director in the US, she questioned, because she also found the same issue that I did. Data was being copied and pasted. And the answer that came from people in India on the phone call was, who cares? It's just blacks dying.
Yes. She was on a con call with that, and she brought this up.
Correct.
And basically it was bury it,
yep.
And we will not do anything about it.
Yep.
How much would it have cost the company to fix the problem rather than spend all that time and money colluding to fool the FDA and fool the Indian customers?
So you have to understand, at that point in time, Ranbaxy was about $1 billion in revenue, right? Just about maybe $800 million to $1 billion in revenue at that point in time. The goal was to become a $5 billion company. if you do what Raj was suggesting, there are two different costs to it. One is that there will be a period of time where there will be no revenue if you're withdrawing all of those. So that's the opportunity cost, essentially. So you're cutting down everything, right? The second is, fortunately or unfortunately, that was a time when we had a very large number of patented drugs going off patent. We had this patent cliff. Atorvastatin was one of them at that point in time. We had a number of these drugs that were going off patent. And the only way to make big money in the US was if you were actually the first to file. If you were the first company to be able to to receive an approval to launch in the US, that'll be a windfall for you. If you did this, all of your first to files would go out of the window. So you're looking at a $10 to $15 billion hit that you would take to the company's top and bottom line at that point in time.
When your 6 project managers were going in to investigate, did they find resistance?
All the time.
What happened?
Well, the first thing was, people wouldn't be cooperative. I mean, we were outsiders. We would go and ask, okay, can you tell us, can you show us the lab notebooks in which, these things were recorded? Because, the way science works is that when you do an experiment, you write down the hypothesis of what you're trying to do, then you write down your observations, and then whatever you deduce from that particular, experiment you do in lab notebooks. And they're very important because that's how your intellectual property is created. And so we were trying to trace down where are those lab notebooks, where you've done all these experiments, where you've tested these drugs, where you've formulated these drugs. Where are the records of patients being enrolled, right? How many patients got enrolled? What are the names of these patients? How old were they? What happened to them? Do we have blood samples, right? Did we have a report from a path lab? A lot of times we are basically told, go away. It's none of your business here.
Now, at one point in 2004, Spreen had confronted Malvinder Singh on the crucial testing data for many of the company's drugs that they did not actually exist, and submissions to regulators had been forged. And he told her to be patient and assured her that everything would work out. But for that to happen, the company would have needed to care about compliance and feel a sense of urgency about protecting patients. And that seemed to be, as you said, absent. They discussed the drugs for Africa, and as you said, that basically they decided that it doesn't matter if blacks die. And when, after the presentation that Dr. Kumar had made to the board, you gave another presentation 3 months later, a slide presentation.
No, this was the presentation that Raj made. I didn't have an opportunity to do. I mean, I stayed back to try and do my work, but they made it very difficult for me.
Okay, we'll come to that later. But what I have here is that, this is at an executive management meeting. I'm starting from here. At an executive management meeting in Bangkok, Kumar distributed a spreadsheet prepared by
This
you.
is prior to the board meeting.
Okay. That listed Ranbaxy's different markets by region, alphabetically beginning in Algeria and ending in Vietnam.
Correct.
And in one column for the problems with each drug, another column for risk, by which Thakur meant risk to, that is you, risk to patients, and a third column, action plan. You had filled in the column for risk to patients with the words high, medium, or low, depending on how much data and what kind of what kind is missing on the company's records. But at the meeting, the company executives, which I find remarkable, it shows the culture of the company, that the executives reviewing the spreadsheet had understood as the column as meaning risk to the company, not to patients. And they then filled it up according to that. And this would make clear that the company would decide whether to discontinue the drugs or temporarily withdraw them from the market or not. The risk to patients did not enter their mind. Now,
what's interesting is that spreadsheet actually has handwritten notes from very, very senior people in the company. Very senior people who were participant in that meeting in Bangkok.
And it had handwritten notes only related to the risk to the company.
Correct. But the point is that they could not, when this was presented to the company during the final negotiation, they could not deny whose handwriting it was.
Yeah. So was it used anywhere?
Well, in the end, the reason why they pled guilty in the US for criminal counts was because they had to prove that they intentionally put money over people, and this was one of the pieces of evidence.
In this, it was also, you said that more than 200 products in more than 40 countries had elements of data that were fabricated.
Correct.
And business needs, the report showed. Business needs was a euphemism for ways in which Ranbaxy could minimize costs,
Correct.
maximize profit, and dupe regulators with approved substandard drugs.
Yeah.
It was in entire markets around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But the question over here is, nothing happened in India.
Unfortunately true.
Nothing for all that came out through the FDA, all the court hearings and everything that happened. In India, it's been quiet.
Unfortunately, it's true.
So would you say that we are at this point still exposed to adulterated drugs?
Well, I mean, I don't think you should take my word for it. I think that if you do a scan of the kind of observations the US FDA, even today in 2019, publishes of India manufacturers, Ranbaxy is gone. I mean, the company no longer exists.
Yeah.
It's changed hands twice. But there are companies that are currently counted as very large, companies within India that make generic drugs, and the kind of things that you find, shredding of documents. 2019 observation of a company based in India. Why would you shred documents? Just before an inspection from a US FDA team, they're trying to destroy documents.
So there's, in Bottle of Lies, the book, the companies that I mentioned are Dr. Reddy's, Wockhardt,
Yes.
Mylan.
Yep.
So this is still happening.
It is happening even today.
Going back to Ranbaxy, there was a culture where Malvinder Singh was insisting that drugs, should be smuggled, carried by executives in their luggage.
Correct.
Into the country. And he was sitting in London and insisting that why are they still sitting here?
Yep.
Why aren't the people?
Yeah.
So the company's president of Global Pharmaceuticals wrote him a letter saying, "Dear Malvinder, I need to explain to you how labor laws work within Europe. As taking these samples to India is in principle illegal, we cannot force people to do so. Normally, however, we find our people willing to take the risk." So it was an extraordinary suggestion. There was also an executive who refused to do it, and in fact suggested that why doesn't Malvinder carry them himself? I'm not surprised if Malvinder did. He might have.
I don't know whether he did or not. I mean,
We don't know that.
Yeah.
But there was one person who was caught carrying the anti-nausea drug Kytril, worth thousands of dollars. And in fact, the carriers were given a letter to carry with them.
Research purposes,
Yeah, to say that it was, to cover why they were carrying it. This was illegal from word go.
Yeah.
So the fact that Malvinder is personally involved in the pushing of fake drug, meaning smuggle the drugs in, empty out the capsules into your own packaging, give them for testing. I don't think it would get worse than that. Now, when it was happening, was there discussion amongst you executives that all of you, that the smuggling, did you discuss the smuggling of drugs? What was the conversation like in the company?
Well, I mean, I can only talk about, my little time there and the kind of conversations I had when I was asked to do an investigation into this. When confronted, people who were running the clinical studies, I was basically said, look, this is how things work here. What's wrong with you? You think you come from the US and you can try and dictate, your ethics on this? This is how things get done. And there's always, a diktat from the management, and we have to comply. And if you don't, then obviously we asked to leave, and we have to find some other work to do. It was a very hierarchical culture in the company.
Well, yeah, that also happened when their counsel Deshmukh had a confrontation with him.
Yeah, well.
And rather colorful language was exchanged where they threatened each other.
Yes.
With Malvinder it started off, to explain to our viewers that Deshmukh was brought in and he, in fact, when he went through all the data falsifications and everything, suggested to Malvinder that he better fix the problem.
Right.
And Malvinder was very rude to him, and in fact told him that he knows where he lives, which is an Indian style of saying, "Main janta hu tumko rehta hu, so you won't sleep at night," threatening him. And Deshmukh answered to him, "Yes, you idiot, I know where I know you know where I live because you've been to my house." And in fact, Deshmukh threatened him back, saying that I have contacts in the Shiv Sena. So it was rather ugly confrontation. But basically what Deshmukh was doing was asking Malvinder to comply with the law.
But you have to understand something, right? I mean, this conversation took place after the company changed hands.
Yes,
this conversation
when
took
he
place.
wanted him to be honest to Daichi.
Where were all these people when the company actually was run by, the Singh family? Weren't these people employed at the same company? Why couldn't they have these conversations then?
Did anyone have, beside, like for example, Abha Pant, who plays an active role in, she's supposed to be the person who's managing regulatory issues. She in fact had a folder saying do not show to FDA with all the falsified data.
Correct.
What kind of a brilliant genius writes do not show to FDA and doesn't remove it when the FDA is coming to raid the premises?
Well, they didn't know that the FDA was coming to raid the premises, right? This was a surprise raid. But the fact remains is that the hubris that tells you that you can write bold letters saying do not give to the FDA, you can get away with it because in India, there is no FDA equivalent of what the FDA can do. You can do that kind of stuff and nothing actually happens to you here.
So Debbie Robertson
Yes.
had said when there was this, Atul Sopti had summoned top Quintilis official Bob Rhodes to India.
Yeah.
And basically he was trying to control the investigation and it was seen as an obstruction.
Correct.
And Debbie Robertson at that time said that the CEO, no less, this was the last straw, not only is the culture of fraud and deceit still alive and well at Ranbaxy, it exists all the way to the top.
Does.
All bets should be off. And she went on to say that the lies were so audacious that she said that in all my years of investigating drug dealers,
Yes.
I'd never had that blatant disregard for the law. They lied right to your face.
Of course.
I was told it's a cultural thing. They understood they could get away with it. Now, under any other circumstances, somebody saying that Indians lying is a cultural thing would be extremely offensive. I would say it's a racist thing to say. But in all fairness, when looking at the issues, we have to admit that it is a cultural thing, that from top to bottom, it was considered all right to lie.
Right.
It was part of doing business.
That's true.
So at that time, when you were working over there and you're working in a culture where lies, deceit, fraud was encouraged, was there no other people who were objecting to it?
I couldn't find any. I mean, I have to admit that my, scope of influence was reasonably small. I mean, I wasn't a CEO of the company. I had a small group of people that I worked with, but it was astonishing to me, that we somehow seems to have checked all our ethics at the door when you went to work for the company.
Was your investigation before the incident with your 3-year-old son? Just to inform our viewers, there was a time when your 3-year-old son got an ear infection and the fever was not going down, and the pediatrician then asked you to switch the brand from a Ranbaxy, amoxicillin, to switch from
GSK brand.
Ranbaxy to another brand, and his fever got better. So was that before your investigation?
No, it was during, because this took a long time to do all of this.
So it was during your investigation.
Yes. Yeah.
And then it's sort of the penny dropped.
Exactly.
That this is what Ranbaxy is doing to people. Now, for example, when the investigations in England took place on thalidomide, where you could see the direct result of a bad drug,
Sure.
which was given to pregnant women,
Right.
and the babies were born deformed without arms and legs. In this case, it's even worse because you cannot see the physical
deformity,
damage until years later.
Correct.
The side effects, so some of the drugs that were found that contained carcinogenic elements.
Correct.
So we won't know until 10 or 15 years later that who was affected by these fraudulent drugs.
And we don't have systems to actually find these things, because 9 out of 10 times what happens is that even if the side effects of poor quality drugs manifest, they're usually written off saying, well, this is natural disease progression. This is typically what happens when you have cancer, right? We don't have systems in place to go back and do a root cause analysis and figure out why is it that we are seeing these kind of things.
So this, in fact, is a dark hole where drug companies have, not only Ranbaxy, all the others also, including in Europe and America, have been marketing drugs which can create life-threatening or life-killing side effects, and we will never know.
Well, you're seeing it happen right now with the opioid crisis in the United States. I mean, this is exactly what is happening, off-label promotion of a very potent painkiller which should have never been prescribed to the kind of people it was been prescribed to. And look, we have an epidemic right now.
Now, in that same board meeting that we were talking about, there was in that report, they mentioned, this is available on the net, details of the board meeting. They wrote that in the minutes of the meeting, chronic therapy segment accounts for 26.5% of the domestic formulation business, growing at 9.9%, which is faster than that of acute therapy segments. Chronic therapy segment mainly includes anti-diabetics, cardiac and neuropsychiatric formulations. Outlook on threats, risks, and concerns. Now, this is interesting. The global generics business has inherent risks of patent litigation, regulatory issues, and product liability, particularly in the developed markets where Ranbaxy has a significant presence. A company-wide risk analysis was carried out with the help of external consultants covering all types of risks the company may be exposed to. So they're only worried about the risks to them.
Correct.
The board did not ever consider the risks
to the patients
of what they were spreading all over the world.
Unfortunately, no.
It's beyond belief that why did this not come up in discussions amongst all of you?
See, here's the thing, right? I mean, you're working in for lack of a better word, I think you're working in an Indian company where hierarchy is so important in those days, right? I mean, you would expect it to actually stand up when Tejinder Khanna came to visit. It was like royalty.
Oh, God. Listen, you guys, this is what you should do. So, I'm lucky if they wish me.
So that was the prevailing culture, right? I mean, J.M. Khanna, who was the head of R&D, he would, his way of sort of, finding out what was happening is just before he went home, he used to kind of walk around the corridors of the R&D building with the expectation that he expected to see people working. And although I don't know whether he understood what they were doing, but the expectation was he's supposed to be physically there. That was the prevailing culture of hierarchy in the company. And so you expect, a low-bench scientist to go up and talk to somebody like that and say, sir, I think what we're doing is wrong. Where do you get that gumption?
But actually that kind of corporate culture is in almost every field in India, including journalism.
Of course.
In what happened in paid news.
Yes, of course.
When your top management tells you that you are to create a package for a politician because he's paying us, and do negative stories against his rival because he's paying us more for the extra, for the negative stories on his rival. This is what journalism has become. This is, doctors taking cuts from commissions, really. Commissions for referrals, for use of particular medicines, for using particular devices. All that is, I think it is pervasive. And I think that part is, actually, some of it is pervasive around the world.
It is, but I think that the challenge is that especially in our culture, from the day that we were born, right, we are always taught to say, respect your elders, don't question the judgment, right? We were always taught to say, your manager knows more than you do. I mean, when I first started working for BMS, the first thing that they did was they made me go through a 2-month orientation, when the only thing that they taught me was everything that you do in this company affects the patient.
Now, BMS for our viewers is Bristol Myers.
Yeah. I mean, I was a young 27-year-old kid at that point in time, but the orientation was that everything that you do, it doesn't matter whether you're a chemist, whether you're a biologist, whether you're a manufacturing QA, everything that you do impacts some life. Now, the challenge that I see here, even today, right, because I do talk to the industry leaders here, is that there is nothing akin to that in our industry.
So
right?
what was your orientation like when you joined Ranbaxy?
Oh, I was just shown an office and basically said, that was your office, start working.
So there was no discussion on...
No, I mean, I did ask, okay, what does the company's value? And they pointed to me, pointed a plaque on the wall that
Profit?
says, Vision Garuda, $5 billion in 5 years.
Now, who do you think, who actually started these fraudulent practices? Because
I have no idea.
was it, were they created during Parvinder's time or D.S. Barar's time or Malvinder's time? Who started it?
I have no idea. All I can tell you is what I saw. I mean, you're asking me to divine where the source of this thing was. I don't know. All I can tell you is this is what I saw. Whether they came in from 2 years ago, 5 years ago. See, the challenge was this, right? This company had no systems in place. There was no processes in place.
But they did have systems in place.
To be the systems.
Yeah.
Right.
They had the amount of detailing that is explored
Right.
in this book on how much time and training and money is spent
In beating the system.
in beating the system by creating pop-up fake plants,
Yes.
by carrying that plant to another place and just showing one sterile
Yeah.
instead of actually doing it.
Doing it right.
So they had their systems in place. I think it's a textbook case which could be a Harvard case study.
It is,
That how they were able to beat the system for
a long-
years,
for a
for
long
decades,
time, for a long time.
and by doing this, so their systems were very much part of their corporate culture
Yeah.
of fraud.
Yes, it is.
Now, would you pin the responsibility of this, the period that you were there? Would you pin the responsibility on Malvinder, Brian Tempest, the board of directors? Who would you say was really responsible for creating this?
The middle management. See, Malvinder was a 32-year-old young kid at that point in time, a Duke, graduate. Knew very little about drug development. Yes, he spent time, on the marketing side of things, how to promote stuff and sell stuff, because that was very obvious. When I used to hold portfolio review meetings once every quarter, the entire discussion was how do we, what is the size of a portfolio? How do we get it out to as many people as possible? That's what his interest was. When you work in a healthcare industry, especially when you work in product development, you really have to understand who your customers are. When you're a doctor, when you go to Vedanta, I mean, I'm sure, the people who are actually designing policies around that are trained physicians. You don't take a marketing person and say, okay, run this business, right? That was the gap. So it was incumbent upon the heads of R&Ds, the vice presidents of manufacturing or regulatory. They are the people who would have stood up and said, you know what, this is not right. This ought not to be done the way that you're asking us to do, right? But the thing is, the culture was in such a way that they would never actually question what is being asked of him.
So, could you explain how Ranbaxy actually succeeded in fooling the FDA inspectors for so long?
Well, I think that the book actually goes into quite a bit of detail to try and, in contemporary, situation right now, when you're talking about strides, when you're talking about US-based Mylan, in the way that they would just unplug the computers while it's running to create a crash, and then sort of use that data to fool the inspectors. You can get really fanciful about these things, If you want to beat the system, there are 100 different ways of doing that. I mean, I saw with my own eyes the steam room, where the FDA inspector would say, I want to see this document, and you'd say, well, that's in that other building over there, can we get it for you tomorrow? And the person would say, fine. And all night, people would stay up, write these documents, and they had a room that actually steam in it. So you put the thing in the steam room and then bring it out the next morning, it looked like an old document. This is the extent of fraud.
So you're willing to pay for a steam room, but you're not willing to
rooms are cheap,
produce
right?
the correct drugs.
Yeah, but see, steam rooms are cheap. You make a room and you
But in the long run, Dinesh.
That's the point. The point here is that if you have a moral compass, right, you don't go down that road. You don't think about creating a steam room. You think about doing it right the first way around.
Now, while you were there, did you hear of the Central Drug Standard Control Organization of India
I dealt with them.
inspecting Ranbaxy plants?
No. I mean, I do know who the CDSCO was, but I don't think that they ever came around to inspecting Ranbaxy plants.
And to inspect your data?
They don't even, I remember at one point in time, one of my team members was responsible for development of this drug, that we were developing along with the Medicines for Malaria Ventures and as a joint venture. It was an anti-malarial drug. So part of that development process was what was called phase 1 testing, which is essentially testing in healthy volunteers, this drug is toxic or not. And I had to go to the DCGI's office and ask for a meeting. And I was just flabbergasted, with the lack of knowledge, with the lack of professionalism and the discipline. The only thing that they were interested in basically, and I was told this, आप अपने बॉस को भेज दीजिए DCGI साहब से बात करने के लिए उनकी बात हो जाएगी. And in those days, Toyota Corolla was newly launched. And
so
that was
they were looking for money?
I'm told that they wanted a Toyota Corolla. It was a brand new car at that point in time.
Wow. Now, the standing committee, department-related standing committee on health and family welfare has came out with a report in which it said a random sample of 42 from the total of 2,167 new foreign drugs approved by the CDSCO from January 2001 to 2010.
Yes.
Of these 42 drugs, all documents were missing.
Yep.
For 3. Of these 3, 1 was not approved in countries with strong regulatory bodies, and the other 2 had been withdrawn.
Yes.
The committee expressed doubts as to whether this disappearance was accidental, meaning the documents were missing. Can you tell us what do you think we should do as Indians to stop this?
It's far for me to tell you, tell anybody what to do, but I can tell you what I tried to do. So after 2013, we spent almost 2 years collecting a lot of data about how the CDSCO works. So if you just give me 2 minutes, I'd like to tell you a story which is very interesting.
Please.
So in India, under our constitution here, health is a state subject. So the responsibility for regulation was delegated by the parliament to CDSCO, who essentially sort of mucked up this whole thing. Our Drug Regulatory Act, Drugs and Cosmetics Act, is actually a pre-independence act. That's how old it is. The manifestation of this problem is as follows, right? So the law says that each state has to enforce quality. So right now, what's in the news right now is this drug, the drug that's actually used in the cardiovascular, practice is called sartans, valsartan, losartan. That drug, it actually, if it's not stored in a stable condition, it reacts with itself and causes a cancer-causing impurity, right? And this is all over the place right now. You pick up the news and see. Companies in the US are recalling this drug. In India, because people start asking questions, okay, what, if this drug is potentially causing cancer, what do we do? And the CDSCO has issued a diktat to state regulators saying, go check out what, is this really true? Because the remit is that states actually have funding through their state health, ministries to sample drugs from the market, send it to the state drug lab, get it tested, whether it's of good quality or not. Now, I'll give you a very simple example. Karnataka state regulators are actually very progressive. They're doing good work. They send their inspectors to go out, in Bangalore and Mysore and Hubli to sample these drugs. They bring it back. They find out that one of these drugs actually is not of standard quality, what CDSCO says, right? The drug regulators and state drug regulator has no remit to do anything to that data, because guess what? Where most of our drugs are manufactured, they're manufactured in Himachal, because that's where we got tax benefits. So we set up a lot of facilities in Himachal. A lot of our API is manufactured in Andhra, in the erstwhile Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So what does an inspector do in Karnataka? They don't have the ability to enforce that. They can't effect a recall, because guess what? The manufacturing license is given by the state drug regulator in Himachal Pradesh. These are systemic problems that we have because our regulations are not on par with what they ought to be. Our DCGI, the Drug Controller General of India, our law says that needs to be a pharmacist. Imagine the kind of medicines that we consume today, the kind of medical devices, the hip replacement plants, the meshes that we implanted. That person has absolutely no medical knowledge how to regulate this. And why? Because the law says that we need a pharmacist. We need to fundamentally rewrite our Drugs and Cosmetics Act and bring it in line with current knowledge, the way that the rest of the world actually works. It is in nobody's interest. I mean, when was the last time when you had a discussion on public health during the time of elections? We don't ask for these things, right? And then, there's an international issue, you make some noise, newspapers write a bunch of articles about this, and that's the end of it.
The thing is that I think largely the public is unaware.
Correct.
For the large-scale adulteration.
True.
A few people in the cities are aware,
know, right.
But largely you are not.
Yeah.
And that is one of the lack of information.
It is.
And also the drug controller position, I believe, is supposed to be the most lucrative in the government.
It is.
Because of
the licenses that they're handed out
and also the fact that there used to be a 2-year requirement to renew licenses, and that now either has been planned to been removed or it has been removed.
Well, I mean, yeah. So for some it has been. I mean, for export, you're still required to issue a CGMP certificate for export. So there's still opportunity. But the thing is, again, I think that we are so far behind, in terms of science, that we really need to look at this, holistically. And the other problem is that, even our practitioners, like our doctors, they are not trained to find out, if you see an anomaly in your patients, right? More often than not, it's ascribed to natural disease progression. You're afflicted with hypertension. This is something that you will see, you're taking medicine, so there's going to be side effects. So why India? Even in the United States today, the medical fraternity is not sensitized to the fact that there could be potential problems of standard drugs. Now we are beginning to do that. Now we are beginning to document systematically that this is what is happening. Doctors don't have time to do any of this stuff. We don't have continuing medical education, in terms of how we grant licenses for practicing in India. So we have some systemic challenges that we need to address.
When you were going through this, when you started, you resigned after you realized that this is not working for you. First of all, what were your thoughts when you decided to resign?
Well, I mean, I think, it was an untenable situation for me. They were trying to frame me to, essentially to, basically.
Let's go back to that. Yeah. Let's start from the beginning on that issue.
Yeah.
How did they treat you before you started your investigation and came up with your report? How were you treated by Ranbaxy before that?
I think, I was one of the few people who came from the US, because Rashmi was there, Qasim was there, me, and a bunch of people from my team. We were essentially sort of given carte blanche to do what we needed to do, because, the reason why we came was because they realized that they needed this. So we were given all the resources that we need to do. But the thing is, after Rashmi left, after Raj resigned, and it was not made public. I mean, even Raj is leaving.
They didn't announce it.
They didn't announce it until until January. He left in August. They're kind of playing around with it, saying, oh, he's out there because his mom was sick and so he needed to go take care. There's all kinds of nonsense, right? But after Raj left, I mean, it was very obvious. They sent auditors after me. They had to start planting, porn on my computer.
No, but let's go back to before this issue.
Yeah.
Everything was okay with them.
Before this issue, I was also finding my way around, right? I didn't know this company. I was trying to find my way around. I was building this, this organization. I was hiring and training people because you couldn't find that skill in India.
But did you have any confrontations or any unpleasantness with management?
Yes, I did.
Before your report?
Yes, I did. I did.
What kind?
Because, I used to hold a portfolio review meeting every quarter. And in that portfolio review meeting, there was no way that I could satisfy every stakeholder. And there was never an opportunity for them to come and talk, at one forum. Because people always got upset with me, saying, why are you, giving them more importance? And I said, I'm not giving anybody more importance, but the perception was because of the role that I was playing, that I was playing favorites with certain people. And I had fights with a lot of people, and I used to tell them, look, at the end of the day, it's not my call whether you receive the money to develop this product or not. That's somebody else's. That's above my pay grade. All I'm doing is putting the data on the table and making you justify. And people didn't like that. But it was never like, because I don't like you, I'm going to try and make sure that I'm going to kick you out of the company. It was never that way. There was a lot of, confrontations going back and forth because, I was doing something that was bringing transparency into the process. Nobody liked that.
So it was from the time you started actually working,
Right.
the whole sort of system didn't work for you, and you didn't work for a corrupt system.
And until Rashmi and Raj were there, I still had protection. I mean, they were my bosses. And if I, like, for example, I give you an example, right? I mean, you asked me, were people cooperative? When my project managers went and talked to them. There were many occasions where, they would come back and say, look, we just don't know what to do because we are not getting anywhere. And I would go to Raj and say, Raj, look, you've given me this assignment. I cannot succeed, or people are not letting us in. And he would pick up the phone and call and say, well, I'm the one who's asking them to do this, so please make sure that you comply. So these are the kind of things that actually happened.
Then when you then decided to resign, there was a period of time when you were going through a dilemma on whether to blow the whistle on them or not.
Yeah.
Can you take us through that? Why were you thinking twice?
Look, I think that the time that I left, it was a very difficult time because I made a mistake of packing everything that I had in the US. I mean, I sold my house, essentially relocated to India because I wanted to do something positive for the country, and I think this is the right opportunity for me to do that. So for me to then go back and then try and find something with leaving my young kid here was very difficult, right? But the fact is, what I saw, I just couldn't sort of digest that. It was not, I couldn't say that, look, I've left the company, it's not my problem anymore. It just took a little time for me to sort of come to the point where I needed to tell somebody about it.
Did you try to look for a job?
I did.
And you didn't find one in India?
I actually interviewed, with several companies. I interviewed with Tata Consultancy Services. I've interviewed another company in Chennai. But their expectations and my expectations are very different. So we never actually came to agreeable.
So you weren't able to settle into a job?
No, I wasn't able to do that.
After you left Ranbaxy?
For 2 years until I started my own.
So how were you surviving?
Well, thankfully, when I was working for BMS, I had a little bit of savings, so that was essentially what saw me through.
And while you were going through this period, did you have a support system with friends and family who understood what you were doing?
Well, so the three guys who actually came with me, from the US, we stuck together. So that was my support system.
They understood
what was going on, right?
Losing your job,
right?
With that actual stigma
Sure.
of being a
right.
troublemaker,
exactly.
whistleblower,
Yeah.
not easy to find a job when you have that on your back.
Of course.
But you found solace in doing it.
It was important for me because I think that, that's the way that I was brought up.
And also the whistleblowing didn't come easily to you either, because when you started writing letters to the FDA and the WHO, you didn't get an immediate quick response or any response, in fact, for a long time.
Correct.
So that was frustrating.
Very.
How did then it finally fall into place?
Well, I think what happened was, WHO essentially kind of, sent me a nice letter saying, thank you for writing, but, well, it doesn't matter kind of thing, right? And WHO has always been a very political organization. They would never do anything that would try and jeopardize their access, quote-unquote, access issue, which essentially is around generic drugs. With the FDA, I think what happened was it kind of built up over a period of time. I started, trying to tell them like the basic stuff, and then, try to give them more information. And I think over a period of like several months, it just got to a point where they couldn't ignore what I was saying. And when I finally wrote to the commissioner, I think that essentially broke the whole thing loose. I mean, Edwin Rivera, he passed away, but he was an extraordinary head of compliance at that point in time at the FDA.
So then they actually used a lot of your information to go after Ranbaxy.
They did.
And then it took a long time.
You did.
And I think it was also dangerous for you at that time because, as you know, what happens to whistleblowers in India, they don't often get rewarded with $48 million.
Well, that was never in the picture actually, until very late in the game. So, yeah.
So, has there ever been a whistleblower award like this before?
In India?
No, not in India for sure, but outside.
Yes, of course, yes.
There has. So did you think did you have it in mind that you would get some compensation?
So I didn't even know actually that this law existed until, I was forced to go hire a lawyer. I had no clue that this actually legal framework existed. That was not the intent at all. In 2007, after working with the FDA for almost 2.5 years, is when I was forced to get a lawyer just before the raid in Princeton. I was asked essentially to say, get your own representation. Only when I got a lawyer did I fully understand that there's a legal framework that does this for people like me. Until that time, I had absolutely no clue.
Take us through that time when you had resigned. You were writing letters to WHO, getting no response, writing letters to the FDA, not being taken seriously. And you were deliberately writing them in a way that it looked kind of somebody who's not that well educated, so that you weren't identified. You're sitting, I can see like you're sitting in a study alone and just getting angrier and angrier and angrier. How did you function at that time?
With great difficulty. I mean, I think that, one of the things that I still do is I read a lot. I mean, if you come to my house, you'll see a big library. That was the only thing that I could do. I still read a lot, and, reading gives me a good way to sort of distract myself, and also, gives me joy. So.
And I don't want to get too personal, but it is an interview.
Yeah.
In Elizabeth Eban's book, it seems to sort of become pretty clear that you did not get the kind of support one usually gets from a wife, I would say usually, from somebody who's fighting a cause.
Yeah.
Usually when a person, whether it's a woman fighting the cause, they usually get support from their husband,
right,
and vice versa. You clearly did not get that. Why? Did she not understand the import of what you were doing?
So it's true. I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, that's the history. But part of this is also that I never actually shared, what I was doing with her for quite some time. Until
that's not fair, is it?
No, it's not. So I think that the fact that she didn't support me actively, that in the time that she didn't know, there's really no way to complain about that. But once she knew, then I think that the priority essentially became that people like me who try to do this thing essentially end up
get destroyed.
Exactly. So that was her bigger concern, that why are you doing this? I mean, look around you. Look at Manjunath. Look at even Sanjeev Chaturvedi today. Poor guy trying to still do the right thing, and look how he's being treated. Look at Kinka. I mean, these are not easy lives to live. People live by principle is very hard to do in this country.
And look at Snowden.
Look at Snowden as well, yep. Well, I think Snowden's, this is interesting, because what is happening today in the US with this whistleblower situation with the Ukraine thing, right? People may think differently of Snowden after this.
After
The current situation resolves itself. I mean, I'm sure you know what is happening in the US with the whistleblower, DNI whistleblower complaint that actually has gone about Trump talking to Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. Today, Thursday, is the hearing in the US Congress, right? If they don't come back and defend this person, whoever is anonymous at this point in time, vigorously, because the expectation is that, like anything else, Trump will essentially sort of destroy this person. But if the community doesn't stand up, if the Congress and the DNI doesn't stand up, and for this person, then people will say, well, what Snowden did was the right thing. Because what other option did he have at that point in time other than leaking, right? He chose the wrong outlet, I understand that. But, you have to look at it in context. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, Snowden's perception of Snowden may be different after this current situation resolves itself. Because, US has very strong whistleblower protection laws, very, very strong. But this is a very unique situation we are dealing with right now.
I think for Indians it's a little difficult to understand why Snowden would basically burn his life to just expose the fact that you are under surveillance. In India, we know we're under surveillance. We shrug our shoulders and move on. Yeah, I know you're watching me, big brother, big whatever. Yeah. So that is a very Western view that my privacy is very important.
Sure.
For us, privacy is not that important, So we have our mother-in-law sitting on the foot of our beds all the time, waiting for her to leave. But knocking on a door before you enter is not really our culture. So that's a different issue, but I think what you went through, basically without emotional support, without financial support, for a long period of time, without any hope of recovering, in the sense that you had obviously no idea that you'd be awarded this money.
Yep.
So you have one of the few happy endings of a whistleblower, And there has been some, as always in India, whenever somebody makes a lot of money, you instantly become unpopular.
True.
And remarks written by given by Ranbaxy or current Ranbaxy employees that he did it because he was disgruntled with whatever.
That's okay. It comes with the territory.
So what are you going to do with this money now?
So as I said, after 2013...
I don't see you the kind of guy who'd buy a yacht and jet skis.
It's not. So as I said, in 2013 we did some work. We went to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided not to intervene at that point in time. But most of what I've been doing for the last year and a half is essentially philanthropic. I have a foundation that's focused on India. We work on, public health. We work in civil liberties. We work in right to information, and I'm doing what I can to support the causes that are important to me.
What do you think people should do? What should journalists do? How should the average Indian protect himself, one, from adulterated drugs, and two, how to move this issue into an area where people become more aware of the dangers of giving your child amoxicillin which doesn't work?
Right. Well, hopefully, conversations like this, right? The fact that you have a large audience who will probably listen, watch this discussion, think about it, and see, okay, well, next time I go see my doctor, I'm going to try and ask a few questions about these things. Look, drugs come, in different ways, right? So, when you take medicine, it goes into your body, dissolves in your stomach, and becomes available in your bloodstream. So the science basically is that there is a range, it's a lower range to have adequate quantity of the drug in your body. There's a higher range, if you go beyond that, it causes adverse reactions. That range is different for different drugs, right? So for example, if you're taking an antibiotic, dengue season, malaria, you take an antibiotic. Antibiotic is broad spectrum. It kills pretty much everything that you take. But if you are, for example, taking thyroid medication, if you have a balance in thyroid, if you're suffering from mental health, right? Mental health medicines are very, very narrow therapeutic dosage. If you're taking, some diabetes medicines, if you're taking long-term heart medicines, these have, sort of narrower therapeutic dosage. If you have a variation, in an antibiotic, you may not feel it that badly. But if you're taking heart medication consistently over a period of 5 or 10 years, and you see, that you're not getting adequate quantity of it, or for example, if you're seeing impurities,
or side effects,
or side effects,
is known to have been adulterated.
Exactly. So the point here is that not everything, not every medicine. But the problem that we have in India is this, right? Because of the way that we have no control over our drug supply, we have what is called fixed dose combinations, right? We have these medicines that make no scientific rationale, but we mix them together because we can promote them as a brand. You think about how many fixed dose combinations exist in our country, right? These things are devastatingly bad. Even, the parliament, when they set up Kakote committee report, they said 337 of these were given licenses to manufacture have no scientific basis, no scientific rationale in it. So the best thing people can do is start asking their doctors, if they don't feel right. If, for example, if you're on hypertension medication and you still feel that, you're out of breath, you go for a walk, you come back, out of breath, talk to your doctor and say, look, why is this happening, right? Most doctors don't even know that this is an issue. Hopefully a conversation like this will actually open some eyes and say, yes, we need to pay attention. Yes, disease progression is one aspect of it. But, when you take bad quality medicine that doesn't have an adequate, active ingredient, or it has impurities in it that cause things that ought not to have been causing the beginning, doctors need to be educated as well. Right? So it's a long-term, solution that we have to think about. But having conversations like this is extremely important. This is what I was in Mumbai on Monday essentially doing the same thing. I think that we need to have to talk about these things.
It got a bit ugly before you left Ranbaxy.
Yes, it did.
And did you ever have any confrontation like Deshmukh did with Malvinder?
No.
Did you have any confrontation with Brian Tempest or
No, I did not.
Malvinder? They were, after all, they did an audit on you.
Yeah.
They couldn't find anything on you. Then they said that you were cruising porn sites, and you did a forensic on them and discovered from the server that they had been they planted those onto your
Correct.
Your history.
Correct.
So how did you react to all that? I mean, did you you didn't want to walk into his office and scream at him?
No, I did. I mean, I did go to, so the corporate headquarters was brand new at that point in time, in Gurgaon. So I did make an appointment, go to Brian, and I showed him. I showed the data saying, look, this is what is happening. This is what Rahul Goswami is doing.
Brian probably ordered it.
Probably did. And I said, I can't work like this. I can't work with, every time if I do something, I have to look over my shoulder, then that's not the environment I want to work in. He didn't say anything. He said, I understand.
That's what he wanted.
Unfortunately.
That's what he wanted. So he
kind of played into his hands, basically, which is fine. I mean, look, that's not the kind of place I want to work in anyway. Because if you have to look over your shoulder every 2 minutes to see who's going to come after you with a dagger, then how productive are you going to be in that place? You're not going to be productive at all.
So do you think it's possible for corporate culture to change in India? Or is this always going to be this obsequious demand, bosses demanding this obsequious behavior from their employees who are afraid that their lives hang on a thread if they don't bow when he passes?
I hope so. I mean, you have to be optimistic, right? I mean, you can't be, so negative that this is.
I think the younger people have to just stand up
Absolutely.
and say, this is not our culture. We won't do it. Certainly, in the new corporate culture, it doesn't exist.
Yes, and I think that it is changing, right? For example, as you said, the young people obviously their work habits are different, right? I mean, even in your business, there are more freelancers today compared to people who are employed as beat reporters. So things are changing. But the thing is, Madhu, I think that the difference when I think about this, right? I was very fortunate to have role models in my life. Raj was a role model, right? He stood up and he said, I am a doctor, and not under my watch. I mean, imagine he left a very, very high-paying job. He was the head of the CNS R&D at GSK. I mean, you don't get to that level at that point. He left that job to come head here. In 2 months, he said, I can't deal with this. Now, I'm sure he must have thought about, what the financial consequences are to me and my family.
Did he find another job afterwards?
He's gone through a much tougher time than I have. But those are the people who
That's
stand
awful.
up.
That means the good people suffer.
Exactly. But the thing is, he had his moral compass. He said, look, this is what I can do. And I can't believe that we don't have such people in India. I just can't believe that. For a country of 1.3 billion people, I refuse to believe that there aren't people who have their who know their true north, who have their moral compass, right? It's a question of finding, giving them opportunity to flourish, right? I mean, what does Dan Ariely say? It's a two-sided coin. Greed is one side, opportunity is the other side, right? People don't do stuff when you know that there's a probability of getting caught, that the law enforcement is going to come after you, right? That fear needs to exist in all of us.
Well, actually, right now, what one sees is very young people are being taught how to survive by bribing, by going by, and this is the culture. That culture is more pervasive than a moral culture. So at this point, we're at the stage of get ahead by any means. It doesn't matter how. And I don't see, if there's a cycle, hopefully it'll turn, where a certain moral compass will come back.
Right.
But in all fields, one of the biggest problems is the people who do have a moral compass and the people who don't. And if you look at it in any field or in any business, that is the struggle that's going on between two groups. And I don't know if there's a solution. I don't know if it's going on around the world, but it's certainly in India.
Well, I see this in the US as well, right? I mean, look at the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I mean, how else do you explain people who stood for free markets, for principles, for ethics, don't squeal?
Well, look at the rifle lobby, the gun lobby, and how they have been able to pervasively corrupt everybody.
Exactly.
Even despite all the shootings.
But see, the interesting thing is, you're right, the gun lobby, NRA, is extremely powerful, but look who actually is beating them. It's moms demand action. A bunch of mothers who basically said, we had enough. These young women, older women have come together and basically say, we will not let our kids die at the hands of this guy. And they are the ones who are actually beating the crap out of NRA today. So the thing is...
So what we do need is some sort of concerted campaign against adulterated drugs, because it is people's lives at stake.
It is.
Millions of people's lives at stake.
Yeah.
And it's far more insidious because it's it is a subterranean killer.
It is.
And we have no understanding of how it is destroying people, old people, young people, the most vulnerable of the lot.
Absolutely.
By the way, what do you think of Yusuf Hamid, who sort of turned things upside down?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I've never met him. I've read of him. He certainly seems to have done things right. Beyond that, I can't really say much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.